lecture can be quite in depth, and so this is sort of going to be leading up into how we look at the whole horse to address lameness issues. The first question comes up because are asymmetries related to lameness issues? There's a lot to do with asymmetries. Some people believing they have to do with lamenesses, some people don't. A lot of research has gone into different testings of asymmetry, from hoof spread, showing that it reduces performance. So any asymmetry in hoof spread measurements does suggest unequal loading of the limbs, and the animal, it may contribute to injuries and reduced performance. Skeletal forelimb measurements and hoof spread in relation to asymmetry also shown in this study that it contributes to injuries and reduced performance. Equine hoof shape as an effect of soundness. This was done by Sue Dyson, and also shows that asymmetry leads into lameness issues. Excuse me 1 second, I have to get rid of the sharing thing here. It's right in the middle screen. There we go. Sorry. Here's a study on 336 horses that also demonstrates that horses with bilateral asymmetry, limb length disparity, where the scapula is dropped on one side, does affect performance in the horse. This was done with racing horses. Again, here's another study showing that head and foreleg traits also affect the outcome of the racing. Mismatched feet is the second most common abnormality of foot shape. This problem itself may not cause lamenesses, although there is a greater risk of horses with this foot shape becoming lame. Looking at this from another angle, chronic pain in the foot or elsewhere in the limb is a common cause of mismatched feet. Often one of the feet has a long toe, low heel conformation, and in most cases the good foot is the lower, wider foot, and the bad foot is the narrow foot. Other than the last sentence by King and Mansman, I would agree with this, as often we find mismatched bodies in the lamest of our horses. There's another study done on gait defects, which showed, again, there's a relationship. So really, key points as a farrier here for me is clearly asymmetries are related to lameness issues, and that we we have to, I'm sorry, I'm hearing Bob, Jeremy. Hoof shape and hoof spread are related to injuries and reduced performance. So what are the causes of asymmetry? There's a lot of opinion into this. There's environmental factors that have clearly have caused body imbalances and asymmetries. From unbalanced and poor riding, we see this in our therapeutic riding programs, where we can see a horse develop weight-bearing issues from riders hanging off one side of the horse. Steep terrains, exercising and training, ill-fitted equipment, imbalanced feed, and grazing behaviors all can be environmental factors. Injuries, just any injury can cause an asymmetry in the body. Chiropractic misalignments or impingements. This is what got me into looking at the whole horse. Way back in New Mexico, I went over to Texas and went to Parker Chiropractic School. Mostly not to, I didn't follow through with it, not to learn chiropractic, go on out and practice chiropractic, but it was to bring that back into the farrier world and look at the horse from the top down instead of the bottom up. Congenital factors, birthing problems, birth wedging issues, or dystocia. This is very common in humans also too, that the birthing process causes shoulder dystocia and causes a lot of these issues right from birth. There's been some recent studies actually, both in the human and the equine world, actually looking at in utero lie, as well as the birthing wedging issues of foals coming out and how it's changing scapula as they wedge in into the birth canal. In uteral factors, a lot of in the human world is focused on this with Zink's compensatory pattern, or Zink CCP, that because of in uteral lie, most babies get overstimulated on one side, and that's the side that comes out as a functionally longer side. And it didn't matter whether the child grew up to be left-handed or right-handed, 2/3 of the world had the same shorter functional right leg. And they brought this over to the equine world and has been following it with ultrasound studies of in uteral lie. As the baby floats around inside the uterus, they'll eventually lie on their back and prefer one side more than the other, as in this drawing here, and they can tilt one side or the other. And they're starting to track this to see if the same pattern that exists in humans exists in horses. So what do asymmetries look like in horses? Well, I'm sure every one of us have seen them. We have horses like this. You can see the two different scapula heights. You can see the curvatures in the neck and in the rear, all the way up to the pole. Here's a tape ruler over another horse, so you can see the bulged out withers on one side and the atrophy straight wither on the other side, scapula higher on the left, scapular lower on the right. Here is another horse. Pretty much 2/3 of the horses you look at are going to look like this. You're going to see chest asymmetries. We call this D cup, B cup syndrome, where we have two different chest sizes because of the shoulder points. You can see forearm indifferences. The entire body's not the same. There's a close-up of that one. Looking down, which is not a normal view for us farriers, you'll see that the shoulder points do not line up across this animal. This makes it very hard for the person riding to ride this horse balanced. From behind, we can see the differences of how they're using the rear end. You'll see the musculature differences down each side. Of course, the infamous low foot, high foot. This is a weight-bearing issue of one limb being utilized more on the ground. This goes for the hind feet too. This is just not a front foot issue. Rotational deformities. If you have an animal that's rotated more or toed in on one side more, they will obviously have a form of functional limb disparity that will affect its gait and body balance. See from the crook in his leg that this animal is going to have a weight-bearing issue. Navicular issues. It's interesting to note that most of our horses that quote-unquote have navicular syndrome, as well as diagnosed navicular disease issues, all seem to have functional limb length disparities, as well as an entire body imbalance and asymmetries. This issue here of a narrow foot and a wide foot, and the wide foot on the left here having toe crack that's been laced, stitched, sutured. We stopped going after these toe cracks unless they were supturating, but otherwise addressed this issue through the other foot, and the cracks went away. So the key points as a farrier here for me are there can be many causes to asymmetries. We need to learn how to identify them and recognize the asymmetries. How do we document and detect them? That's and identify them. Well, certainly we can use on-track systems, and we can point out on the horse and then make those comparisons looking at the differences between each side, measuring angles. I'll flip that back and forth. We take radiographs, and we can see an impingement in the spine of the neck here. We also have been using bone scans, and this is not something you just do on any animal, but a lot of animals who've had issues with asymmetries start showing up in lameness issues, and often they go in for bone scans. Here's a nuclear scintigraphy bone scan of the limbs of the animal. And what we do is we take these, as in this case here, and what we do is map out the angles in degree differences. And we can actually see that there's differences between each side of the shoulder. And when often these animals will go back for a bone scan again, we can tell if whatever we did as a farrier has helped this animal, because we can actually measure this off the bone scans. Same thing goes for the front of the legs. We can see the imbalances in the leg from the spots that show up hotter on the scans. When we have a book a booklet chart system that we document static and dynamic physical measurements and observations. In our static phase, what we do is we note the mane and tail hang, limb pointing. We note heel height and toe length and differences. Hoof width, we measure these. Hoof shapes, as in we follow the Scott Simpson's basic 5 shapes. Phalanx angles, we note phalanx angles. A lot of times we take radiographs to determine them. We measure for fetlock knee and hock heights to the ground. We take pictures and look at the chest, the pectoral muscles, and point of shoulders and measure them. We measure the scapula height and differences, and we do that. There's several different ways people do that. We palpate over the top of the shoulder. Lasers are often used off the top of the scapula and shot towards a wall balance, so measurement differences can be measured. We observe pelvis and rump and differences. And we make note of which limbs are easier to pick up, which are tighter, which are more flexible. In our dynamic phase, we watch the tail motion and sway, how the animal walks away. We watch the belly and rib motion and sway. Front and hind leg motions and their landing position in relation to the front legs and tracking. Do they track directly behind the front legs, or does one track just inside and one track outside? We note PSIS, or tubular sacral hip hiking, and ASIS, sashaying. Note that, and we also make note of cadence and hoofbeat. This way, when we, as well as with the rider reports, we can also be able to measure and tell if what we're doing is working. So key points for me as a farrier is identify, measure, I videotape, I picture, and I document any way we can to confirm if what we're going to do, the treatment modality, is working or not. This is how we experiment around and find out what reduces these asymmetries. And it takes a while to develop these better skills, observation and palpation and manipulation. Palpation has been, and manipulation has been very hard. We often work with veterinarians who teach us this and go to classes. Observation, we're just not taught to look at horses this way, and it takes a while. Chiropractic classes are often very helpful in learning these observation techniques. So here's an animal in California looking down at the animal from a ladder, and you can see that he has some chiropractic issues in his neck. And he also has a scapula height indifference. He wasn't moving very well. Now this is the animal here that got me thinking. As farriers, we often would come into this case. We would, on the left front foot here, have not much to take off. We'd probably put a wedge pad in under there at times. And on the right front, we realized it was more upright. We'd take down the heel, sometimes even put a wedge pad underneath it, which didn't really make sense to me after taking down the heel. But we'd come back 5-6 weeks later and we'd do the exact same thing. We'd cut down the heel of that foot. In 5-6 weeks, we'd come back in, cut down the heel of that foot. And my questions to myself were, what happens if we do not cut that heel? Is it going to grow forever? No, they stop at some point. Why do they stop? Why do I keep cutting that heel and it keeps growing back I swear, overnight. Well, I love this saying about that. Albert Einstein, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I decided, yeah, I'm a traditional shoer, but I like to take a holistic viewpoint, which is basically just looking at all the parts. I want to look at the whole horse from the spine down and try to identify what the insult is of the animal. Stop being a symptom tracer and try to see if the problem in front of me is a symptom which may need treatment, or is it the result of a further insult? Balance differently. Instead of doing the T-square method, which I find a lot of times to be off in many horses, when we shoot radiographs, they may be in T-square balance, but they're not in balance when we take radiographs of joint spaces. And they're certainly not landing and loading in balance. So I looked back in some old books, and these pictures were often used to try to describe what was going to be the ideal horse that you should be buying. And in Farriers' book here, he was obviously suggesting the first picture would be something more ideal of what we would want, and it would have these angles and such. But I ended up applying these to the horses and doing this in a computer program to actually see if we can change conformational issues. Now, there's certain conformational issues, no matter what, we aren't changing. But some leg positionings, camp forward, camp backwards, there are things that we can do to help change these. Chiropractic has taught me this in a lot of ways, especially with chiropractic adjustments. You can often immediately change the stance of a horse from behind, as well as from front and behind looking down. In an example of this, here would be a horse, the right side of its body, together, and we obviously can see that there's a difference. And just even between one side of the animal, when we drop our lines, we can see that the body is different. The scapula is lower on the left-hand picture, left side of the animal, and higher on the right side, and therefore it changes the shoulder angle and the position of the way the leg stands. So I can actually do things to this leg, one leg or the other, to actually, as well as chiropractics can work on it, massage therapists, and we can actually see if we've made any changes in this horse, positive or negative. This brings me along to an accidental discovery, that I've used quite frequently in horses. My own horse one day stepped into some chalk from a chalk line that we were dropping a chalk line, and I needed to refill it. And as he walked away, I noticed one side of his foot wearing off, the chalk that he stepped in. So I went back and chalked it again, and he did it again. And so I started to play around with trimming and found out that I could utilize chalking to help me determine landing and loading of the animal. So often we'll chalk the bottom of a foot, barefoot, or shoes, and walk the animal off about 40 feet in a straight line and check the wear pattern of the foot, and to help me determine how this animal is landing and loading, and trim this animal accordingly. So the sides that are chalks worn off, I would trim a little bit more and re-chalk them. This is an example of this is a horse where looking at this foot, it looks dramatically out of balance. We would remove inside hoof wall on this because the coronary band's not parallel to the ground. It looks like it's jammed up on that side. It just doesn't look level. Now, this picture is slightly skewed as I'm not showing you what the upper body looks like, to show you the point that a lot of people look right here without looking at the upper body. When we actually chalked him and then shot him afterwards, we actually found out we should have taken a little bit more hoof off the outside of this animal. Here's the radiograph that was shot from the front and checking out the joint spaces. So when we look at the leg from up above and the way the animal was walking, clearly the animal was still slightly out of balance. So the key points for me as a farrier is chalk isn't always for kids. I can use it. In light of radiographs, chalking can help us accurately assess imbalances in the foot. We've been able to do this a lot since I have a radiograph machine and allowed to take a lot of radiographs of feet in order to check their balances. Looking at the whole body and not a few of their parts. This has greatly helped me as a farrier to assess the whole body and not just where the soreness issues directly is. It's the number one thing that's directly affected me as a farrier to be able to help more animals by helping to find the insult. And clearly doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is insane, as in a upright foot. Here's an example of an approaches now that had gone through saddle saddle reflocking, had gone through several veterinarian and massage therapist visits, had lamenesses in his back end, and it wasn't getting better. This simply was an L2 and 3 lumbar misalignment that immediately when the animal was adjusted by the chiropractor and a few other places, the saddle wear became the same and the animal immediately got better. So this was just a chiropractic adjustment. Here, hind end, we go to try to pick up the left hind foot, and he would try to plant us with us or try to kick out at us. And so after putting, and the reason for that is the PSIS was lower on that side, so when we picked up the leg didn't drop and the spine impinged on it. And so what had happened is chiropractors had come on in, but this animal had a permanent injury in that area and things wouldn't take. So we ended up putting a 3-degree wedge on this animal, and the animal stopped kicking out like that. The animal's rump came up, filled out a little better. And so this helped this animal go forward and not have any further lameness issues. I often deal with young horses, and here's a little foal. This was a case from down in Mississippi. I got to know the veterinarian at the university very well because this animal was to autonomy. Here's what looking down its spine looked like. You can see the scapula is higher up on the left than it is on the right, and it had some body imbalances. This is what its foot looked like. It's a classic upright club foot, and again, it was scheduled for tenotomy. I don't have a problem with club feet. I get that. Club foot is a weight-bearing issue, and every one of these animals have a dropped scapula, and we address this differently. We address it by a graph of that. Clearly, I think he was 88 degrees to the ground. We have a major issue here. This is why he was scheduled for the tenotomy. But before he went in, I was able to talk with the veterinarian. We put a shoe on the left front foot, just a regular flat shoe, just to help protect it because it was getting beat up. And then put a lift pad. The animal's scapular height was about 1.5 inches off, so I put about a 1/4 inch pad underneath its right front foot. Immediately, the difference of the tendons more relaxed. And so this is right after. This is the same day. Here we go, day 30. Animal's grown a little bit more heel, but not nearly as much as it used to. Day 35 comparison. Tendons are more relaxed. Here's day 77. That's not my Bud Light can in the background. 19. The pad is being reduced down to 1/8 inch. There's a difference between the two legs. 19, there's a scapula height indifference. It's getting better. The serratus muscle sling is starting to hold in place, and the animal is starting to be worked, so we can build up the musculature on that side. Day 1 to day 119, so you can see the difference. Day 1 and day 119. There's the radiograph. So we've completely brought back this animal from an upright foot to a more normal pathology just by lifting up that foot. So the key for me is asymmetry is often the first clue that the horse may have a possible future lameness issues. Addressing the injured area or chief complaint without looking at the rest of the body, I think, is you're really missing the point. You have to develop a holistic approach in order to look where some of these issues. It means that understanding that problems in the upper body can create symptoms in the legs and feet, as well as vice versa. And put the horse in balance in order to cause the horse to be more comfortable, reduce pain and stress, and maximize performance and minimizing injury. So, Jeremy, that is the basic look into understanding what I go about doing the whole horse approach. Of course, we could go off on another whole hour lecture on addressing and how we shoe for limb length disparities, but I guess that would be another whole lecture.
Yeah. No, we'll just handle a little Q&A right now. I'll remind everybody, if you have some questions or if you weren't really certain on something, we have the question field on the go to webinar control panel under questions. Just type them in and we'll get to as many as possible. Let's go with this first one. Esco, what do you find when you're talking about these holistic approaches that don't involve necessarily hoof care, trimming, or shoeing? What's the role of the farrier in communicating those options to the owner?
Well, that's a very good question, because it often it having to bring up other modalities that people may or may not be comfortable with. For instance, chiropractic. A lot of people are not comfortable with chiropractors coming in, as well as massage therapists. I work with a lot of laminitic horses, as people know, as well as performance horses. It's very easy to get alternative therapies in with performance horses, because people are looking to tweak out and make their horses better and better. But for backyard horses and for people who may not be willing to do that, it can be a much harder issue to overcome. Basically explaining to them, though, that it's a whole body thing, that you can do your part in helping with it and help restore it, but it takes all of us working together, the vet chiropractor, massage therapist, other modalities, doing different treatments, as well as the farrier, working together to get this animal asymmetries lessened and dealt with.
Yeah. Now, you see a big variety of clients. Let's talk a little bit about those that are, or maybe don't quite have the horsemanship experience that you'd hope for. How do you help them understand your role and what can, maybe what's more important, what you can change, or what, more importantly, you can't change?
And through our lectures that we do on limb length disparity, I often teach farriers how to go about showing how what these asymmetries look like and pointing them out. And there's many horse owners at these clinics. I think a lot of people just don't recognize them. And showing them ways that, just by pads onto their feet, wedge pads, lift pads, which a lift pad is a regular flat pad, but when I'm using it for a orthotic therapeutic reason, I'm calling it a lift pad, as we do in humans. And showing them the before and after. So I actually take the time and say, okay, let's watch your horse move. Let's take this on. Is he better or worse? And often they see the dramatic difference there. So you have to have the time to make the time to do this.
Okay. Just a reminder, everybody, we got a couple more questions to go through here. So by all means, if you got anything that we can still get these questions, and if you got anything you want to ask Esco. Okay, let's see here. Would it not be reasonable to suspect that the axial atlas development are more responsible for asymmetrical development of the scapula?
It brings up in the chiropractic world, that used to be a strong point. And actually, I think as time has gone on and more research is done, most issues seem to actually be coming from the hip and pelvis issue and transferred forward. So, for instance, in a human, as well as in a horse, but I'll use a human example right now, is as you develop a hip difference, your body develops, your spine develops a curvature, and you don't want to keep curving that way, so you often then have developed curvatures in the neck, and as well as in C1 and 2, or your atlas and axis. And the same thing goes for a horse. They want to move in a straight line, and you can't fall off to one side, so they will turn their heads and have neck issues often. That doesn't mean some of these issues didn't come from cervical or the neck at all, but it seems like most of the issues seem to come from the hind end in our sacral areas.
How does bruising that shows at the trim dictate your trim, pad, or shoe, whatever you're using?
Could you repeat the first part of that, Jeremy?
How does the bruising that shows at the trim dictate what you're going to do with that trim, or whether what kind of pad you'll use, what kind of shoe you'll use?
Well, that's a good question. Often I will try to identify where I think that bruising is coming from. For instance, I have a PRE stallion that we did approximately 8 weeks ago, and had some major bruising that just appeared in the hind foot, center toe to outside by 3 inches, and bright red. Made note of it to see how what has changed. Now, the animal did come back from a major showing event, and then 4 weeks later, when we trimmed and shod the animal, that bruising was nearly gone. It was diminished. It was only 1 inch long, and it was very, very light. So it had dissipated. So the insult there had gone away on its own. Now, bruising can be caused for all sorts of reasons. So the key is problem solving to find out if this is just a bruising that was done by accident or natural, or is this an ongoing issue of landing and loading or body imbalances. Also with training and riding, which is sometimes a more difficult conversation to have with a trainer.
Okay. Now, are there any concerns about false readings from using chalking?
I haven't had, that is a good question. I haven't had any. You understand it's a dynamic way of balancing the horse's foot, but where we just did this at Meredith Manor is where we had a horse that on T-square at the school was inside high, clearly had a medial branch higher. And when we chalked him, and looked at the horse differently. I have a different approach of look where I don't, excuse me, I'm rambling. I have a different approach of looking at the horse from the front, and I stand more in front of the horse and lift up its leg, as well as looking at bone structure. And he presented as lateral high. When we chalked him, he wore off the lateral side, and obviously radiographs confirmed that he was when we do these, that joint spaces are closed a lot of times on that side. So we haven't had where chalking has been a false. We used each leg in the chalking system to determine the balance of that foot. I will say, even with rotational deformities, where I thought where we would get that issue show up and for us and help us balance out the foot, I would have expected it differently, but we haven't gotten false readings yet. That doesn't mean that potentially you couldn't, but it's greatly helped us help balance very crooked-legged horses for sure.
Here's a little bit of a controversial question. Do you find any issues that with farriers doing radiographs, or should that be left to the world of veterinarians?
Well, in the United States, there's several, my machine's registered in several states where anyone can own a radiograph machine, farriers as well. And in other states, you have to have a veterinarian sign off on it and use it under vet supervision. I have no issue personally with farriers. It's an expensive piece of equipment. I have no issue with farriers learning correct radiograph procedures and using them to help with shoe placement. Now, some people would say something about diagnosing and stuff. Well, as farriers, legally, we're diagnosing stuff all the time as long as you stay in your realm. When you say the animal's got a contracted heel or miscellaneous, it's got thrush. These are diagnoses, but you have to stay within your realm. And so for most farriers, this isn't a piece of equipment that most farriers would have. Usually, people that travel around usually do. But if it's going to be controversial, then as well as if you have great veterinarians to work with in your area, then you wouldn't need it. But often there's areas that there aren't veterinarians are 300-400 miles away with a radiograph machine, so there's a considerable distance. But using them for shoe placement, determining where you want to place your shoes and how is a very effective tool for high-end farrier work. It's not something I would say a backyard person farrier that's shoeing backyard horses would probably ever need.